to talk about Hinduism for sort of the first time, okay? So this is going to be an overview. Hopefully we'll get all the way through this overview for today's class for just sort of the introduction. This is a very long view of history for Hinduism because it's the oldest religion that we deal with it's the oldest religion in the world. So this is sort of a rough map that gives an idea of where people are, the dominant religions that people practice exist. You see here, the subcontinent, India, is where most Hindus live. But this is a world religion. It's a religion where you find people of this religion all around the globe. So high concentration in India, it's where it originates. But today you find it's a global religion. It's not just regional, okay? Something like 1.25 billion. We'll see with all of these religions, it's somewhat a problem of how you do the census, how you do the demographics determines how big these are. Who do you include? Who do you not include? All of these religions suffer from that kind of problem. I oftentimes point out, like, what's the guy on Big Bang Theory has a guy, Raj, right? And I mean, like, he calls back to home, and his parents seem very traditional in a sense. They seem like they're practicing Hindus. But if you ask him, like, are you a Hindu? He might be like, well, yes, my family's Hindu. So, but if you ask him, like, do you practice? Like, do you do puja and that kind of stuff? He'd probably say, well, no. Right? Do you include him or not include him? Right? So that's the problem with demographics. It's up to the person who's taking the census in that sense, right? All right, so we're going to look here at a couple of things like the origins of the term and a little bit of the geography and demographics. Hinduism is the third largest religion in the world today after Christianity first and Islam second. It's the second fastest growing religion in the world after Islam. This is a difficult religion in some ways to talk about as one religion because it's really an amalgamation of different kinds of rituals and stories, beliefs that have developed over a very long time period in India, and oftentimes have some things that they don't seem like they should fit in the same religion because they seem like they're opposed, they're opposites in some sense. And yet, we want to say this is definitely like one religion. So we use the term Hindu or Hinduism as sort of an umbrella term to look at all these different traditions that have developed over this 4,000-ish year period, right? So if you started reading that first half of the chapter 4 in Hinduism, it talks about this problem. The problem of there's many different gods and goddesses that we're going to talk about some of them in this class. So in that sense, we generally categorize Hinduism as polytheistic, more than one god or goddesses, right? But on the other hand, the chapter also talks about this idea of monism, of all of reality, all of the universe is really one thing. And within that one thing are these various different gods and goddesses and that kind of stuff. That view of monism almost seems like a monotheistic view of sorts. But it can't be both. It can't be both polytheistic and monotheistic, can it? That seems paradoxic to us. And yet, within Hinduism and its long history, you find both concepts. So that is one of the problems of trying to study Hinduism as one thing, okay? So where does this word come from? For most of the history of Hinduism, the word Hindu doesn't exist. That's sort of a strange thing. It's only fairly recently in Hindu history that this word exists. It's after the rise of Islam in the 7th century and when Islam comes to the subcontinent through trade and conquest that the people start saying, well, the people past the river, past the Indus River, those are Hindus. So the word Sindus means the river valley. And so they basically say, well, the people past this river, those are Hindus. That's where we get the term from originally. So it's Muslims that give us that term to start with. Okay? Islam comes to have some like city-states and eventually an empire in India. And it's a monotheistic religion ruling over a polytheistic majority population. Okay? So they have a certain census in that sense. They're sort of the difference between are you a Muslim or are you a Hindu? They want to know that difference during the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. Later on, when the British East Indies Company and then later the British Empire come to rule over India, they take a census. They take over from the Muslims, and so they take a census to get a sense for how many Hindus are there and how many Muslims are there. And their census is very simple. The question is, are you a Muslim? Nope, then you're a Hindu. That's it. Right? Very simple census. Right? So that's basically the way that they use the word, is like non-Muslims are Hindus, check. Right? That's like all the different variety of practices and language and that kind of stuff. Later on, when South Asian intellectuals like Gandhi are arguing for more independence away from the British Empire, they keep using the term because they know the British will understand the term Hindu. And so we keep using the term. But it's not a good term. Like, it's a really rough fit. Okay? So it's really more of an umbrella term for this long history and the traditions that developed within India. So in that sense, it's maybe better to think of it as Hinduism, different time periods, different regions, different beliefs and practices. It's multiple. It's got a multiplicity to it. It's not unified in maybe the way that we sometimes think of religions. So some parts of the tradition argue for kind of a hierarchy to society. There's sort of an inequality based on what you're born into. We'll talk about the caste system a little bit later on. And so that's within the text argues for if you're born into this part of the caste, you must do certain, you have certain jobs you might do, people you can marry, and you can't marry outside of that. Right? That seems like a divinely mandated inequality. But then later on, people like Gandhi are going to argue that's not the case. There's some kind of divinely mandated equality that all people are equal and should be treated equally. And so we'll see towards the end of our section on Hinduism, that's created a range of problems in modern India for sort of like their government, hiring practices, temples. Should all temples allow all different castes into those temples or not? Upper caste people are going to be upset if you let lower caste people into them, that kind of stuff. So it creates this kind of problem. It can't be both equal and unequal, right? And yet you find both argued for in some of the sacred texts within Hinduism. So it creates a kind of paradox. Another kind of paradox is about the way that there's some texts argue that it's important to make sacrifices, including animal sacrifices. It's important to involve the whole of the person, including certain drives like sex and sexuality as part of ritual practices, something we see as very foreign usually in the Western Hemisphere and the religions that come out of the Western Hemisphere. So we'll see that that's sort of a moment of culture shock for people like the British. But then other parts argue for non-violence called asceticism. Asceticism is rituals, doing certain practices that deny physical drives and impulses, things like fasting. Right? You don't eat even though your body's like, I'm hungry, and you're like, no, we're not going to eat because you're pursuing some kind of spiritual or religious experience, right? So those are paradoxic. It can't be both, that you have some kind of focus on the physical world and your physical drives, or on the other hand, you shouldn't. Those are paradoxic, and yet you find both of them in Hinduism. Right? So this is a complex religion in that sense. The two largest world religions, like we said, Christianity and Islam, usually the ones that we often in the United States know maybe more about because they're the larger ones here. Hinduism is quite different from Christianity and Islam, those two monotheisms, in the sense that there's not like one identifiable founder of Hinduism that you can look to and say, that person founded Hinduism, like Jesus for Christianity or Muhammad for Islam. There's not one person. Okay, so we'll see there's various different like gurus and that kind of stuff throughout the history of Hinduism. There's also not one book like the Bible for Christianity or the Quran for Islam. There's several different texts, and if you start reading the chapter, it talks about several. We'll probably talk about 6 or 7 of them briefly to show how it develops through time. But some Hindus follow one or a couple of texts, some follow others, and that's not seen as a problem. It's not a sort of issue that you have to follow one book, otherwise you're not a member. And it's not really like that, so it's different in that sense. There's also not really like one person in charge of worldwide Hindus or one institutional structure that makes the rules for Hindus worldwide, like say the Pope and the Vatican for Roman Catholicism globally. There's not really anything like that for Hindus. Okay? It's a religion that we often call decentralized. There's not a central institution governing the rules for everyone. It's decentralized. Different ashrams and different groups, different gurus that people might follow. So it's different in that sense. Yep.
Is there one for that for Islam?
What's that?
Is there one thing like that for Islam?
Kind of, but not exactly. There's some institutions like Azhar and Sheikh al-Azhar who are like, have a strong opinions. Their opinion counts for a lot, but not the kind of real centralization and strength that you see with like the Pope and the Vatican. So similar, but not quite the same. So if the word Hindu comes along much later in history, what's the word, or how do Hindus describe their religion? What's the term? So the Sanskrit, the original kind of sacred language of Hinduism. And so the word originally that Hindus used to describe religion is dharma. We'll see this word again later on for Buddhism. We'll see several of these terms from Hinduism also in Buddhism, but used in slightly different ways. Okay? In Hinduism, though, the word dharma means duty. The duties you owe to your family, to your community, to your coworkers. Right? As your parents get older, what duties do you owe to taking care of them? To your children as they grow up, what duties do you have to them? To your neighbors in your community, if there's, I don't know, say a draft, you have the duty to go and fight. To your coworkers, if you call in because you're like, I'm sick, right? Somebody's going to have to pick up the slack, right? So different kinds of duties that you owe to one another, right? That sort of is the notion. So in that sense, the word dharma means the way things are intended to be, the way they ought to be if a society is operating well, if everybody is performing their duties admirably, okay? So considered in that sense, this is the legal codes, the law, the rules, the way life and thought ought to be if people are being good people. Right? And this goes all the way back to sort of the ancient world, in part because human nature, at least in some senses, hasn't changed that much, as far as like the duties you might owe to raising your children or your parents as they get older, that kind of stuff. Right? So that's the general sense of what dharma means. So where do Hindus live? Mainly on the South Asian subcontinent in India. But India is a democracy, so it's a secular democracy, at least right now. Nepal is the world's only Hindu nation by charter, by constitution. Pakistan and Bangladesh have significant minorities of Hindus. The little island just south of the Indian subcontinent, Sri Lanka, is Buddhist, but has Hindus on it as well. There's also other places, different islands that have Hindus as sizable majorities as well. One of the places that I've been that has one island within the context is Indonesia is a Muslim majority country with many islands. One of the islands, though, is a Hindu island. That's the island of Bali. So if you've read or seen the movie Eat, Pray, Love, I have not. When I was on Bali, there was a whole bunch of middle-aged white women who were doing yoga because they had read or watched this movie and were like, I want to get in touch with, I don't know, whatever. And so Bali is very different in the context of Indonesia because it's Hindu. Like on the neighboring island of Java where I lived, it's very Islamic. Like the legal code, the culture, people dress very conservatively. Then you go just hop on a plane and go over to Bali, and I don't know how to say this well. So there's a bunch of drunk, half-naked Australians wandering around, surfing all over the place. And so for people who are sort of strictly observant Muslims who come over to the next island, they're just like, this is Sin Island. Like, what's going on, right? So that's why after 9/11, the very next terrorist attack or whatever was the Bali bombings. They blew up the hotel where there was a bunch of drunk, half-naked Australians hanging out because they were just like, Sin Island, not today, right? So different places have that kind of context, in part because they're Hindu versus other religions, okay? So the demographics. So there's around a billion and a quarter billion, depends on how you take these numbers, including some of the groups like I talked about with Raj, those kind of things. In North America, there's over 1 million Hindus. Arizona is actually the only state that has Hindus as the top minority, the largest minority. And DC, but they're not a state, so whatever to them. But Arizona's population has risen very dramatically over the last 25 years as different companies have hired people from India and they've come to work here. And so all of a sudden, in the last like 20, 25 years, a whole bunch of Hindu temples have popped up around Arizona and become quite large. It's a pretty recent development. There's also a somewhat sizable conversion of Europeans and Americans, white people, to Hinduism, especially during the late 60s to the mid 80s. The Hare Krishnas, they focus on one particular god in Hinduism, the Krishna,